And welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Robert McLaughlin. Robert is an architect and historic preservation specialist at the Kansas State Historical Society and the State Historic Preservation Office. He's also principal at McLaughlin Design Associates. He's a co-founding board member of KCmodern, a group that promotes modern architecture through education, preservation, and advocacy in the Kansas City area since 2005. Recently, Mr. McLaughlin has expanded his focus to researching modernism across the state of Kansas. Robert penned a nomination to the National Register of Historic Places for the brutalist style Wichita Public Library in Wichita, Kansas, and is currently writing a National Register multiple property document form for the work of Wichita architecture firm Schaefer, Schirmer, and Eflin. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Robert McLaughlin.
Hello, everybody. It's great to get to see all you this evening and talk about some modernism in and around Kansas City. It's interesting. We've been in this sort of virtual format for like over 18 months, and this is the first really large presentation I've done on Zoom. So hopefully we'll pull this off without any major glitches, but as he said, I am one of the co-founding members of KCmodern, and some of you may not know what KCmodern is, and I'll give you our mission statement. KCmodern is dedicated to promoting modern architecture and design through education, preservation, and advocacy. You can sort of see what we're doing by going either to our website, kcmodern.com. We are on Instagram and pretty active at kc.modern. And Facebook is just KCmodern. So I encourage you to reach out and join us on those platforms and see what we're up to. I'm going to start out tonight by talking about some of the mid-century homes in the Kansas City area. This used to be our motto, better living through modernism, but first, let's talk about just some of the characteristics of mid-century modern homes. One of the most obvious and thing that people think of the most is lots of glass, expansive use of glass in mid-century modern homes. So here we see a big window wall and open to nature in the structure. Another primary characteristic is post and beam construction or exposed structure. That can either be in wood, or sometimes we'll even see steel used in mid-century modern homes. Open floor plan is also one of the primary characteristics. Usually we'll have open living room and dining room, sometimes just partial partitions between the kitchen, but that's a big feature of a lot of mid-century modern houses. Indoor, outdoor living, sort of that California style, if you will. Those large expanses of glass often have sliding doors and access some outdoor living areas. Simple, clean detailing. You'll often see that in both the window design and things like cabinets that are very sleek, sometimes just minimal hardware or even no hardware with touch latches. And then captured outdoor space is another characteristic that we like to talk about. And that's where the architecture actually wraps around and sort of defines outdoor spaces, either courtyards or little atriums, just side courtyards sometimes. This happens to be an Eichler with a center courtyard where the living area is wrapped all the way around the courtyard. Just a little bit of history about mid-century modern architecture. One of the big influences was the case study house program. This is the Eames House, and these case study house houses were published in Arts and Architecture magazine, a California magazine that really promoted that mid-century modern lifestyle. And may know the Eames name more for their furniture, but they designed their own house. You can visit this house in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Another very famous case study house is the Stahl House by architect Pierre Koenig. This might be the most famous photograph of a mid-century modern house. This photo was taken by Julius Schulman, and you'll see this photo on all kinds of books and literature about mid-century modern housing. Then we can talk a little bit about some of the more famous builders of houses that carry this mid-century look. Probably the most famous is Joseph Eichler. His Eichler homes, built homes by architects Jones and Emmons, and ironically, we ended up with some of these same type of homes designed by Jones and Emmons in Kansas City. Palm Springs, when you think of Palm Springs, you almost always think of mid-century modern houses. And there was Alexander Homes in Palm Springs, and all of their homes were done by the architecture firm of Palmer and Crissell. And they were experts at taking a basic floor plan, and just by putting different roof lines on it, putting the garage in different places, turning the plan different directions, they took one floor plan and had hundreds of different looks for their houses. This is one of the more famous shots of one of their houses. So why don't we jump into some Kansas City examples? One of the most important house is Marcel Breuer's design for the Snower family. This is in Mission Hills, Kansas, mid-50s house. Pretty unusual house for Mission Hills. Obviously, it sits on a big double wide corner lot, and developers have always had their eye on that lot because they thought that house was much too small for the lot. But Marcel Breuer was actually an immigrant to the United States, and the design of this house is actually semi-based on the design for his own house in Connecticut. But this is a very important house. Other important houses, this is the Sondern Adler residence by Frank Lloyd Wright in Kansas City. It was actually done in 2 phases, and the original house was very much a small Usonian house, and this is a picture of that era. It's not quite finished in this photo, but you get an idea of the look. Today, it's been added onto, and the addition is by Frank Lloyd Wright. And this house recently sold at an auction, and ironically, the people who bought it are not living there, and the owner who owned it before is still living in the house. But very interesting Frank Lloyd Wright house in Kansas City. Here's an interior view of that house. This is in the newer part of the house where it's much more expansive than a Usonian house. Another Frank Lloyd Wright house in Kansas City is the Bott House. This house was designed before Frank Lloyd Wright died, actually completed after his death. And this is in Briarcliff and has wonderful views of the Missouri River and downtown Kansas City, looking at it from the north. inside the house. All the original furniture that Wright specified is still in the house. Just a wonderful house. KCmodern did a really well-attended tour of this a few years back. And it's not a house we get into a lot, but if you ever get a chance, do go to see this house. Kind of a spinoff of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses are Bruce Goff houses. We're fortunate that there are 4 of those in Kansas City. I'm going to show you 3 of them. This is the Searing House. It is probably the smallest Goff house in Kansas City, or it is the smallest Goff house in Kansas City. Sits on a pretty nice corner lot in Prairie Village. And the interior kind of explores a theme that we see a lot in Bruce Goff houses, where a central fireplace or central fire element, central skylight, and then bedrooms arranged around that. Another house by Goff, also in Prairie Village, is the Hyde residence by, obviously by Bruce Goff, but same thing, kind of a central fireplace and then rooms kind of organized around that fireplace and living area. Some of Goff's houses can be rather unusual. And not sure I would call this a suburban house. It's near UMKC, Nickel residence. I should tell you, former board member Rod Parks, who owns Retro Inferno, actually owns this house, and he's always been a good friend of KCmodern, and we've had several events there over the years. This one is really open in the middle, and there's actually a fire water table in the middle of the house in a sunken conversation pit. And that sits over a giant skylight, and you can see what look kind of like beads hanging down. That's actually kind of resembles rain if you kind of look at it in the right light. Sort of another kind of outsider house in Kansas City. You may have seen this from above or below, Albert Yonda House. He built this himself with the help of neighborhood teenagers. And after he built this house, he kind of gave up on Kansas City and actually moved to California, but left this great, unusual mid-century modern house, very organic feeling, kind of like the Goff houses. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about an architect named David Runnels. And for several years, Albert Yonda was one of David Runnels' employees. This is a great and strange house, the Dome House by engineer Robert Campbell, just a few blocks from downtown Overland Park. And Campbell has Bob D. Campbell is the name of the structural engineering firm that he founded. And interesting, this was kind of a test bed for work he did with Shaver Architects out of Salina, Kansas. And they did many, many schools throughout Kansas and throughout the Midwest, really. Even there's a few of his buildings in California, as well as like Michigan and other states. But this house is actually in the process right now of trying to be added to the National Register of Historic Places. So I sort of follow this one closely from my work with the state. Then you can't talk about modern housing in Kansas City without talking about Drummond Homes. Don Drummond was a production builder, much like Eichler. And one of the first modern homes that Don built was called a Flatty. That was a nickname, I think, given by people later. But the home was designed by Earl Flattop Smith. And he was a California builder and designed his own floor plans. They were designed to be very simple. And I did look him up, and yes, Earl Flattop Smith does have a flat top haircut in all the historic photos I could find of him. But ironic that Eichler also borrowed plans from Flattop Smith. And so Joseph Eichler's first houses he built were actually this same design as well. Don Drummond's sort of really first big break into having a house designed by an architect for production building was the Revere home, and that was designed by architect David B. Runnels. And this proved to be a very important house for Don Drummond because it sort of broke him into that mainstream modern home movement. And this home was published in Life magazine, Architectural Record, Architectural Forum. It's on the cover of a sort of well-known book about houses from that time period. Just a pretty amazing house. And like some of these other builders, Don was able to manipulate this plan around by rotating it so that it had different appearances depending on which way it was angled towards the street. And there's these houses, many of them were built right on one street called Rose Circle. And you can actually see, I don't know, it might be like 8 of those houses, something like that, all in one little street called Rose Circle. Here's one of those houses today. Still looks very much the same as it did back at that time. Another vintage view from a magazine of that house. And that house proved to be so successful that Don Drummond went on to hire David Runnels to design another house. And we've dubbed this house the minimum house. It was sort of meant to be a lower price point than the Revere home, single story, had a semi-attached single car garage. And it's just the minimum of house that is still a 3-bedroom house. But if you think about the time period, this is late 40s, early 50s. We had a lot of soldiers returning home, and they were anxious to buy houses, and they needed something that was affordable. And so this house, again, a production plan was built, and many of these still survive today. Many of you guys may know that there was a huge flood in Kansas City in 1951, and Don Drummond built these. We call them the flood house. They were built to be put up very quickly. Many of them actually had flat roofs. Some may have had pitched roofs just for variety. But we know of one little section of these houses. We know from Don that some were built other places other than Johnson County, but we actually don't know where. So if anybody ever sees this house somewhere else, let us know, because we're kind of anxious to know if any of the others still survive. By 1952, Don was moving into a house that he called the House for You in 52. It was designed by one of his employees and his wife, Francie Drummond. Gare Sloan was the employee. He was basically Don Drummond's draftsman. And this 52 house came in two versions, an L-shaped version or a straight ranch. The original was the straight ranch, but Don was looking for ways to basically fit it onto a smaller lot than the long ranch. And so you got this nice L plan, and you can always pick these houses out because they were originally built with Pecky cypress siding, which Don told us that was the cheapest siding he could get. But it's ironic that almost all of these houses still have their original cypress siding, despite it being kind of a cheap wood with lots of character because it has these holes in it. It's super, super decay resistant. So I just challenge you to go somewhere and find as many original sided houses as you see of these 52 houses. By 1955, Don was looking for ways to sort of up his game, and he got involved with a program with an NBC television show called Home. And the show was hosted by Arlene Francis, and they decided to do a promotion. And it was kind of the brainchild of Joseph Eichler again, because the plan that they chose to build was actually a refinement of an Eichler plan that he was building throughout the Bay Area of California. And this is that plan. It was designed by A. Quincy Jones of Jones and Emmons. And as I said, it was built in 1955. And Don told me when we interviewed him for KCmodern that he said he got to be on the national TV program, and they actually filmed them moving furniture into the house. And he said he figured he had about 2 minutes to sell 100 houses, but he never sold 100 of these. But there's a nice neighborhood of them about 78th Street, roughly around Mission. And there's quite a few of those houses there mixed in with the 52 house I showed you. Here's some of the literature from that program. That's Arlene Francis standing over the model that was built by Jones and Emmons. And they had that model. We have a list of episodes of basically every time they talked about this program. And here's a picture of the Eichler house that was being built right about the time they built that house that Home built. And I should say that builders built that home all over the country. There was something like 12 builders who signed up for that program. Here's one of the intact house that Home built in Prairie Village. And the success of that plan led Don Drummond and his wife Francie to meet with the architects and ask them to design a house specifically for them, not a shared plan. They went through a number of iterations, and they ended up settling on the plan that they called the Castilian. It's nothing really Spanish about the plan, but we determined that this plan actually is a variation of a plan that Jones and Emmons designed for a showpiece in Michigan. And it had flat roof and steel structure, so they adapted that plan. And it's an H-shaped plan is the best way to describe it. Here's a picture of one of those. This was the first Castilian I actually photographed. This house just recently sold. Probably set a record for a price for a Drummond home, but this is at roughly 98th and Mission is the best way to describe the location. This is a more recent view of the house. Lots more landscape since these owners have owned the house. Here's another Castilian in that same neighborhood. And, they're just wonderful houses. And because the plan is H-shaped, there are windows on both sides of pretty much every bedroom and every space in the house. And then the kitchen and all the bathrooms are in a center core of this house. Another house, we just call it the late Drummond Ranch. This was built roughly the same time as the Castilian. They're kind of mixed in with the Castilian at 98th Place. But Drummond also built some custom homes. They weren't all production homes. This is the Reed residence. At this point, Drummond had kind of had a falling out with David Runnels, the designer of that first split level house, the Revere home. But then they kind of patched things up a little bit. Drummond said the disagreement was that Runnels had sold the plan for the Revere home to another builder to build out of town, and was driving down the street one day, and that builder was building the house just like less than a mile away from where he was building the house. So they had a little disagreement, but I get the sense talking to David Runnels' family and Don Drummond and his family that it was a bit of a love-hate relationship between the two. They did a lot of work together, but sometimes they were at odds with each other. Another David Runnels house is the Climate Wise home. This home was published in House Beautiful before it was even built. Took a while to build the house, but what's interesting is this is early 50s, and David Runnels was including lots of passive solar elements in the design of his house. So just interesting that sort of green building was even thought about back in that time period. More of that love-hate relationship with Drummond and Runnels. This is Don Drummond and Francie Drummond's own house at 6920 Belinda. Don gave us this photograph. It was just this gigantic transparency of like 8 by 10, obviously shot in a very large format camera. And we think that that was probably shot by the famous photographer for House Beautiful. His name was Maynard.
Did you throw something? Oh, because of her. Sorry, I didn't see.
Oh, somebody's jumping in here. Maynard Parker was probably the photographer of this. This is David Runnels' own residence in basically, I can't think of the name of it, but just on the Johnson County side of state line. We don't have any really good pictures, but it was published in the magazine. And so these are scans from that magazine. One interesting note about David Runnels was that he was a graduate of Cranbrook, and he was friends with Charles Eames, Florence Knoll, and all of that Cranbrook crowd, because he was actually there. We have photographs of him with Eliel and Eero Saarinen, and the photo was taken by Charles Eames. So it's interesting. He was hobnobbing with the movers and shakers of the mid-century modern world when he was at Cranbrook. Sort of jumping off the Don Drummond bandwagon, another well-known firm here is Kivett and Myers. They're more known for their big commercial and institutional projects, but they designed a few residences. This one is in Mission Hills. It's the Kumino residence, and there was actually a home next door to this that was designed by Cliff May. Unfortunately, that home has been torn down and sort of McMansion built in its place. Just another view of that house. We hope to have this on a KCmodern tour someday when things get a little more calmed down and we can all meet in person. Another kind of modern architecture player was Carl Stenstrom. This is his own residence. Unfortunately, this residence is no longer extant and has been torn down, but it's kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright style residence. Use the sort of desert masonry where they would put stones in the form and then pour concrete around the stones. Some of the concrete and stonework I understand is still there, but the roof was in danger of collapse, so they demolished that house. So that kind of concludes the residential part. I thought we would also kind of take a look at mid-century modern in commercial structures. And I thought we might do that by taking just kind of a drive down the Metcalf corridor. In our minds, Metcalf corridor includes buildings a couple blocks either way of Metcalf, but many of you might remember this old A&W root beer that was on Shawnee Mission Parkway, right at the Metcalf interchange there. But the building is still there. It doesn't have the little center extra peak, but I think it's part of the Kia dealership at this point. 75th and Metcalf was kind of a major crossroads in the mid 50s, late 50s. And this is the bank that's there at 75th and Metcalf. This is Metcalf Bank or Metcalf State Bank. This is the architect's rendering. Just a little bit of a detail shot of that rendering. You can see the M on the roof, and here's that building today, still extant. Last I knew, there was it was no longer a bank, but I believe there's an event planning place. I'm not sure if they're still planning events after the last 2 years, but I always loved the little center thing on the roof. It just sort of screamed like Apollo escape capsule or something on the top of that thing. Here's an interior picture. Some pretty cool light fixtures, and it was a fun little building, and just only a few blocks from their main branch, which was a little further down Metcalf. We'll get to that one later. But a lot of people either love or hate Cat's Drug. This building basically designed to kind of look like a billboard for cats. There's a little photo magic going on because the sign never really had that position, but the design of the building was twice as tall as it needed to be just to draw attention. And I think over the years that's been Skaggs Drug and Osco Drug, and nowadays it's CVS Drug or Pharmacy. And they about 10 years ago the building was actually in danger of being demolished, and we tried to creatively shame them a little about demolishing this building, and managed to get them to at least push that off for a little while, and did some actual remodeling to the building, which was kind of amazing. Some other sort of googie architecture things that were in that Metcalf corridor. Tasty Freeze. I like this building. There's actually a tasty freeze that still remains of this design in Olathe on K7. If you've ever drive down, I don't think it's called Tasty Freeze anymore, but the building is definitely still there. We all miss Whitehaven Motor Lodge, especially their sign, and big kudos to the Johnson County Museum for saving that sign. If we didn't save anything else, at least we got the sign in their museum. But there's the Whitehaven Motor Lodge not long after it was built. Postcard of Whitehaven. You have to remember that that was basically 69 highway back in those days. So the logo there says 20 minutes from the heart of Kansas City. Might be a little more than that today, but we really missed the Whitehaven. That's why I've got quite a few pictures of it here. And then the sad picture of the bulldozer getting ready to tear the building down. Here's the main branch of Metcalf State Bank, also called Metcalf Bank, but nowadays it's still operated as a bank, but it has different owners. But this is a real favorite of mine, and it was designed by Kivett and Myers, who we've talked about a couple times here. Finished in 1962. Just a wonderful concrete folded plate design. And we're lucky that this one's still here. I'd love to see us get this one on the National Register sometime, just so we save a little bit of the old Metcalf corridor. It's disappearing fast, but here's a view from the street. Really gives you an idea of that folded plate concrete roof. O'Neill Oldsmobile. Don't know if there's actually anything left of that building. There might be something left, but it doesn't look like this anymore. Also by Kivett and Myers. We all probably might remember Venture Store and the black and white stripe sort of billboard awnings that they had on there. The Rio Theater. I did a little research on this, and it is on the National Register. It was built in 1946, and it was originally called the Overland Theater. And it was designed by a well-known designer. He wasn't an architect, but he designed theaters all over the country. And his name was Robert Bowler. And we're lucky to still have that intact and restored. When they started restoring this, the ticket booth and the marquee were actually missing. So they did a great job of restoring that, and we're lucky it's still here. This next little section is kind of an ode to this. I like to call it kind of everyday modernism. There's just these fun little buildings along Metcalf. This one, it's actually been fixed up a little recently since this pictures was taken. I don't know who designed it. There may be people out there who do. If you do, let us know. But kind of a little bit of a Frank Lloyd Wright vibe to this. And it's just a fun little office building in Old Overland Park. Another little building, kind of the same size. And I think we found out this was maybe a veterinary clinic at some point, but just, you know, these small mid-century buildings are really in danger in that neighborhood because the development drive is so strong. Henry's, some people may remember the Henry's hamburger chain. It was before my time in Kansas City, but I still hear people talking about it fondly, and I love how the H was incorporated into their roof design there. Shakey's Pizza Parlor. I wouldn't call this like a high design example of mid-century modern, but Patrick Zollner, he loves to call this style Buckaroo Revival. Has to have shake roof, and I guess it's missing maybe the board and batten siding, but it gives it that ye old look that was part of Shakey's image. Smacks, boy, I showed this to Alan Hess, the author of the book called Googie, about Googie architecture, and he was just fawning all over this building. We don't have any great pictures, but fortunately we have this rendering. You know, the pictures are all like this. Someday I think I'm gonna come across a picture of this, but I do love this picture because you could get your French fried onion rings for 20 cents or your pork tenderloin for 39 cents. So looks like they had some good specials there at Smacks Drive-In. The building is a survivor. This was the standard car wash. For a long time, it was known as the Turtle Car Wash right on Metcalf. Boy, this thing I feel like has a bullseye on it, but it's that same idea of that folded plate roof of the bank we looked at earlier. You know, we drive by these every day and we take them for granted, but then one day you're just going to drive by and this thing's going to be gone. Here it is today. Unfortunately, somebody decided to paint the roof blue, but still love this building. And, you know, sometimes these nondescript buildings, it's more about the signs than the building itself. Villa Capri, I mean, you could go to Villa Capri and they had glow-in-the-dark murals on the walls of Villa Capri. John's Space Age Donuts was next door. And I mean, who wouldn't love a building that had this as a logo on it? This logo of John's Space Age always cracked me up. But fortunately, Villa Capri has relocated. The building is threatened. Last I checked, it wasn't occupied. And unfortunately, John's Space Age, I don't think they're in existence at all at this point. So talk about buildings with signs. Sometimes the building itself is a sign, and Max Phillips 66 service station sort of meets that criteria. I mean, most people who are from that era will immediately recognize that big V-shaped roof as a Phillips 66 station. The only thing we're missing is the 66 badge on the top of that little tower. But I've heard some rumors that Overland Park's finally, the city's letting the people that wanted to put a coffee shop in this, it may finally actually happen. I think they've been trying to do that for like 5 or 6 years. But anyway, great fun building, and you just see these and you immediately know what they are. And then there's this sort of sleeper building that's one of my favorites, Newcomer's Funeral Home. It was Overland Park Funeral Chapel for a while. They still own the building. They were trying to run it also kind of as an event center now, but I think they actually don't even do funerals in the building anymore. So this is another building on Metcalf corridor with a bullseye on it. There's basically a 6-story building built next door to it. Remember I talked about courtyards being a defining element of mid-century modern houses. Well, notice the little courtyard on the corner there, and has these gold screens and red arches. This is a really good example of neo-formalism. Got the pleasure of working on this building a little bit on the interior, more so to try to keep them from mucking it up on the inside. But it's a phenomenal space, and has a Hauer screen at the front of the chapel, and kind of a three-dimensional puzzle kind of screen, and those barrel vaults. And then there's this funny building next door to that one that has kind of similar barrel vaults, but it's another one of those everyday modern buildings that we kind of take for granted. Shawnee Mission West High School, a little bit off of Metcalf, more like Antioch, but you know, what a great example of modernism this thing is. And you know, if you look close towards the entrance, you can still see some of the original building, although a lot of these schools have been added on to so many times. It's really hard to see those original mid-century bones. And Danish Village, I should know the architect of this, but it's escaping me right now. Apartment complexes, really nice example of board and batten. And then we get to King Louis, and I think I misspelled Louis in there, but King Louis Bowling Alley. This is the original version when it was just a bowling alley. And if you notice in the center of that rendering, there's kind of a red roof there for the entrance. This is what the original entrance to King Louis looked like. And that actually was removed when they added on the Ice Chalet. So our wonderful hosts, Johnson County Museum, we get a little nod to their building. This is before the renovation, the spire and the sawtooth roof, again, before the renovation. And how lucky are we that this building still exists and is now the home of the museum. Here's the Ice Chalet on the inside before the museum. And here we have the all-electric house inside the ice rink. So when you get a chance, if you haven't been there, go see that. Go see the Paul McCobb exhibit that's still open, and just enjoy the mid-century goodness there. Another blast from the past, and we're still moving south on Metcalf, Glenwood Manor Motor Hotel. Scott Lane, who is one of our founding members, he remembers working there in the restaurant as a teenager, but they also had the Glenwood Theater next door. And some of you may remember the old sign, or even more recently, the sign which was moved to Metcalf Mall. And just a great lobby on that Glenwood Theater building. Here's an old rendering and a couple views of the inside. And we're kind of winding down, but you know, even the Amoco gas stations were kind of cool mid-century. We all miss French Market. Had its last gasp here not too long ago. And unfortunately, Valley View State Bank, I was really disappointed. This is an architects Boyle and Wilson, but they recently made some changes, and you can't quite make it out because it was a hazy day, but that's actually kind of fake wood grain siding on the building now. So unfortunately, these buildings have targets beyond just being demolished. Sometimes they're remodeled to the point where we don't care for them anymore. And then we all miss Metcalf South. Some pictures just not long before they demolished it. Pictures of the inside. And don't worry, guys, I'm winding this home, but Sears at Metcalf, at the Metcalf South Mall, the Sears building was kind of run independently. Valley View Shopping Center, about the only recognizable landmark there would be the Hardee's, which is still there. And the Betty Crocker Treehouse Restaurant and Bake Shop, still there. Last I remember, AAA And we'll probably just use this as a stopping point and open up if there's any questions. Andrew, can you, do people raise their hand, or how are we going to handle questions?
Yeah, gosh, thank you, Robert. That was really amazing. And going down Metcalf like that was super cool. I've wanted to either read a blog or see a presentation about Metcalf like that for a long, long time. So really appreciate that. Yeah, if you have questions, folks, go ahead and type them out in the chat for us. That's probably the easiest way. There's quite a few of us here. In the meantime, I'm going to give just a couple of quick announcements while we're waiting for your questions to come in. Robert mentioned the Paul McCobb exhibit. That's our current temporary exhibit. You can see a graphic there for Mary McMurray, director. Pretty fun little graphic there. Paul McCobb was a mid-century modern industrial designer. So he designed furniture and china, glass, tiles, fabric, all sorts of things. And we have a wonderful local collection from Sam Hildreth on display. That's up through January. So come in and check that out. We also will have some upcoming programs on September 16th, one called Democracy in Design. Faculty from JCCC's Fashion, Merchandising, and Design program will explore the creations of clothing designer Bonnie Cashin, who held many of the same design values that Paul McCobb and others from the mid-century modern era did. And that's an in-person program. There'll be some examples of Bonnie Cashin's work there for us all to see. On October 7th, Latinos on the Santa Fe Trail. This year is the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail, and Dr. Jean Chavez will be exploring a topic that we don't often talk about: merchants and traders who went east up the Santa Fe Trail into the United States. That is also an in-person program. Both of those are open for registration right now with reduced capacity. So we look forward to seeing you all at those programs. So let's see, we do have some questions coming in. Somebody was asking about roof lines, especially on the residential architecture. She mentioned lots of lean-to, but also some gabled roofs. Were those equally popular for mid-century modern style homes, or was there one that was more preferred?
Lean-tos were definitely a thing here in Kansas City. Slightly more conservative version of mid-century modern, and we definitely in Drummond's work see more of the gable, although they're really low pitch gables. Most of them so low pitch you can't even shingle the roofs. You have to use flat roof technology. Certainly there's some flat roofs and there are some shed roofs. Another favorite of mine is the ubiquitous butterfly roof, but didn't have any good examples other than the sort of warm up the Palm Springs example. But good question.
Another question that came in, I think it came to me directly, was where were average Americans being exposed to modern architecture, or maybe how? I know you mentioned several.
Andrew, I couldn't hear the first part. Sorry.
Oh, maybe I cut out. Where were average Americans being exposed, or how were they being exposed to modern architecture? I know you mentioned several publications, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, even the television program, that Home program on NBC, I mean, they were pushing kind of a modernist agenda. What's interesting is 55, they did that program. It was a very modern house, but a year later in 56, they did the program and it was a much more conservative house. So people were seeing it on television, sitcoms, they were seeing it in, especially in magazines and newsprint. You know, just like you can buy your Better Homes and Gardens today, you know, at that time, you would see a mid-century modern house. In fact, Better Homes and Gardens did a yearly kind of plan that people could buy from Better Homes and Gardens. And you know, they would have examples of it built throughout the US. And there are several Better Homes and Gardens houses here in Kansas City. So it was in the mainstream at that time.
Great, thank you. The California style, or really I think just so many of those residential homes that we saw, how popular were they? I mean, how many are we talking about? The few examples we talked about, or hundreds or thousands of homes within the Kansas City area? Do you have any idea of how
Um,
popular?
You know, Eichler in the Bay Area, where you had the climate to really appreciate that indoor outdoor living and the large expanses of glass, he's known to have built over 5,000 homes. We've heard Don Drummond, when he was still alive, talking about building as many as 500 homes. I'm sort of skeptical of that, but I would say if he did build that many, maybe it's more like 50 of them that are the real hardcore California style glass enclosed walls. Maybe more than that, maybe more like 100, but it'd be an interesting survey project to go through and like document them. And Scott Lane is actually doing a lot of documenting of the residential in Kansas City. So sometime we may have to have him on just to talk about that project. So.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Another question came through. It said, tell us more about the National Register you've mentioned. How is a property added and what is your role in that?
I work in the office, the state office that basically looks at those applications before they go to the National Park Service. My role is not directly in the National Register. Jamie in our office is the person who deals with all of those throughout the state. She's really overloaded with work. But basically the process is you would submit a property in what's called a PSIQ, and the entire staff, including myself, looks at all the PSIQs. And as a staff, we kind of give it the thumbs up or thumbs down that it meets the criteria. It looks original enough that it still has all its character defining features. And if we think that it has a good probability of being put on the National Register, we will help people write the nomination. We don't write the nominations ourselves, but we kind of give them examples, give them outlines, and they would write the nomination. A nomination can be anything from 5 pages for a small house to 25 pages for something like the Wichita Library, which was a pretty complex building. That's the one I wrote here recently for a brutalist building. And it's likely the first brutalist building that was put on the National Register in Kansas. Once the application gets in and we think it's refined enough, that application goes to the State Board of Review. They all read it, and then we get together quarterly and they will vote on those nominations. And then if they are approved, and some, even if they are not approved in the state, would go on to the National Park Service, and then they decide if it meets the standards, the Secretary of the Interior standards. So it's a bit of a long process. It can take a year or more from beginning to end of the process, but that's pretty much how it's done in Kansas. It varies a little bit state by state in the first steps.
Thanks for talking about that. It's such an important thing. I know there's information online through Kansas State and also online through the National Park Service. To read more about that if folks are interested. And on the museum's website, you can see all the ones that exist for Johnson County currently. We have those listed on our website as well.
Oh, great. That's good. And KSHS, Kansas State Historical Society, is the website. If you just Google that, you'll get right there. and click on the tab preservation, and it'll walk you through step by step. So.
Awesome. Well, if there's any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. This will be the last call. We did have one that's really a two-parter come in, and it's a good question. The first part is, what made this style of architecture fall out of favor? And the second part is, did all the glass make these homes more expensive? And I would add, to build and to maintain.
I didn't get.
The answer to more expensive is yes. That Castilian was a very expensive home for its time, probably the equivalent of about a $400,000 house maybe at this point. And they are expensive to heat and cool. What was the first part of the question?
Yeah, it was, no, it's okay. It was, what made this style of architecture fall out of favor?
There were a number of things. I mean, you know, by the time we got to the 70s, everybody was doing what I was sort of dubbing the Buckaroo revival. You know, it's shake shingle roofs, back to that kind of pitched ranch. There's some examples that they even call like Hansel and Gretel houses. It was almost a backlash to the minimalism, where they would go to these really ornate but not in necessarily like a historic precedent. You know, they'd have dove coats and things that were historic precedents, but they just had lots of gingerbread on them, is the best way to describe them. So it's almost a backlash reaction. But what's interesting about that, Andrew, is mid-century has made a huge comeback, you know, since the 80s and 90s. It's actually been more popular in the 80s, 90s, you know, through 2020 in this time than it was at that time. The popularity has lasted longer than the original popularity. It's kind of interesting. Wow. I find it ironic, but
yeah, that is. Two other quick specific questions for you. Are there any Fay Jones homes in Kansas City area?
None that I know of. That's an interesting question because I just returned from taking my daughter to Fayetteville, but where his houses are very common. The closest Fay Jones building is probably Powell Gardens, but no homes that I know of.
And the other question with that one was, let's see, lost it. Is there a story about the Bruce Golf House at Lake Quivira?
Yeah, that's the fourth one that I didn't include in my presentation. And I don't know all the stories of that. One thing is it's behind a gated community, so it's harder to get to see. It was on the market here 3 or 4 years ago. I seem to recall it's actually next door to a Yonda house out there as well. One or the other of the houses had a fire, which changed the interior a lot, but I do know the Bruce Goff house, whether or not it had a fire, has been altered considerably on the inside. So, but that's about all I know. Scott would be a good person to ask that question, Scott Lane.
See if he puts it. He's been answering some questions in the chat a little bit. Here's a good one too, and I get this question a lot. A lot of folks contact the museum wanting architectural plans or information about their homes. I'm always happy to look up in our database to see if we might have any historic photographs of your home or the neighborhood your street is on, or your house, the street your house is on, or your neighborhood. But we rarely have that type of information in our collection. And the county doesn't tend to have architectural plans or things like that either. They will have plats for neighborhoods. But this person asked, and this is a great question, I'm told the house I own is a Drummond. How can I confirm this?
Probably the best way to do that was to contact one of us at KCmodern. We, especially Scott Lane, could probably tell you for sure whether it was or was not. You're kind of leading into that, well, you know, where could I find the plans? And your best chance for finding the plans of your own house are actually the hope that somebody kept the plans of your own house, because it's just, unless you know the original architect's name, and sometimes you can find an archive of his work, it's just really hard to find those plans if they're not passed down from owner to owner. So hopefully that answers that question.
That's great. Thank you. That's all the questions I see coming in. I think we've gone just a little over our time, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording.